Good morning. Calling a meeting to order. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to the New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Offices Law, Section 100, etc. For purposes of this meeting, I am designating Julia Lee as the recording secretary. And today we have before us consideration of proposed amendments to Rule 101H. Why don't, Chad, you want to give us a little bit of the backdrop to this, and then we have open discussion.
Sure. So existing Board Rules 101H is an exception that allows for the acceptance of travel-related expenses from firms that have business with a city, provided that those expenses meet some conditions. The first is that the trip has to be for a city purpose and could have otherwise been paid for with city money. The second is that the travel arrangements are appropriate for that city purpose. So usually that's articulated in advice as not requiring first-class airfare or five-star accommodations. And then the third category is that the trip has to be no longer than reasonably necessary to accommodate the city purpose that's the purpose of the trip. So in that case, the public servant could not be accepting travel-related expenses from a firm for time on a trip where they are not conducting city business, where the agenda being empty, they are simply at the location. So this provision allows public servants to receive these travel-related expenses, and that allows city agencies to engage in activities for which city budgets might not otherwise be able to provide those opportunities. So usually this manifests in public servants being able to attend conferences, summits, or other sorts of events where a city budget being limited, the city might not be able to foot the bill itself. And it allows the city to tap into these private resources to support its work. In the draft that was circulated on November 18th, the proposed revisions were to retain those three conditions and to add two additional conditions. The first, to incorporate formally into the rule the board's longstanding advice that any agency had approval of the acceptance of such a trip be received in writing and in advance of the trip. And the second was to provide conditions on the solicitation of such travel-related expenses. The initial draft on November 18th included a prohibition on a public servant soliciting travel-related expenses for themselves, and a prohibition on that public servant's subordinates soliciting travel-related expenses for them. In response to concerns that were raised by a board member that this restriction would perhaps inhibit the city from accessing sort of the sorts of resources that would allow it to send public servants on these events, staff did some thinking about that, about how to respond to that concern. And that highlighted that that condition was inconsistent with the conditions on solicitations found in Board Rules 114, which governs official fundraising. And in the subsequent draft circulated on the 10th, staff proposes to have the solicitation prohibition incorporate those restrictions in Board Rules 114, which is that public servants could not solicit travel-related expenses for themselves from firms that have particular matters before that public servant. And that any travel-related, the gifts of travel-related expenses received by the agency are reported in accordance with the already promulgated and effective restrictions in Board Rules 114.
I have just one preliminary thought on the statement of basis and purpose, and then I'm happy to go further, which is I think you mentioned that in the opening sentence, you mentioned there are 29 advisory opinions on this area. Mm-hmm. Obviously, but this is not codifying all of them, and I did a quick count and counted 11. I think you could use a second sentence that says about dealing with the gifts of travel, that whatever the number is, just to leave, so you don't leave the implication that we've now taken care of all the 29, right, and anything that we haven't done are not on the rules. So I think it needs another sentence about what the changes here proposed address issues that were raised in X number of advisory opinions. There were 11 specific citations. You might be picking up more, and then either in a footnote or at the end, maybe just actually list all of them, just so the public knows that the other remaining 18, 17, they're still out there, they're not codified, and we're going to get them to them or not, or get to them or at some subset of them down the road, just to make it clear that we're not dealing with all 29 here. So it needs a sentence or possibly two right after there.
Where exactly are you?
I'm on Exhibit 1, page 2, line 15.
I have extra copies of the December 10th.
Yeah, working off of the December 10th version, yeah. The language is the same in the earlier one.
Yes, the language is the same, just because the citations are a little bit.
Yeah, but just to make it clear that this is not all 29, this is just, I counted 11, maybe there are a few more that are picked up by implication that are not specifically cited, but just some number, and I think either in a footnote or at some kind of appendix, is that the proposed rules here are intended to codify the following advisory opinions. And just leave it, and not say anything about the ones that were not, and just leave that for some future occasion.
That's no problem.
That was my only thought. Other than that, I'm open for whatever discussion people think is appropriate.
I have a couple questions, but one building off of that. I had the same idea, and then also on page, I guess on the new one, on page, the old version, it was page 5. See if I can find it. There's one that does not cite, okay, so line 10, that does not cite to an AO. The line 10 through 12.
These have accrued leave.
Yeah, do we
Yeah.
have it, what's the applicable, is there an applicable AO there?
There's no applicable AO there. In the course of providing advice, this is a topic that has come up frequently, in part because this is something that public servants often ask questions about, and it's a frequent topic that comes up with the agencies and the public servants, and the proposed rule would require simply that it would codify the informal advice that has been provided by staff, which is that it's permissible provided that the public servant is bearing all their own costs of this extended travel, that neither the city nor the third party would be paying those costs, and that it's the new restriction that it just receives the agency head approval. All travel is going to require agency head approval under the proposed rule, so this would simply strap that in altogether. It would all be reviewed by the agency head at once, and that's fine, provided it receives the agency head approval and meets the qualifications. No additional advice would be needed from staff or the board.
You might want to insert the word informal then, the board's longstanding informal advice.
Sure. So it'll be informal at page 5, line 10.
Right, the
of
board's,
Exhibit
I would say
one.
the board's longstanding informal advice, so that, to clarify to
Yeah.
get rid of the implication that there is an advisory opinion out there.
We cite one
Right,
for every,
right, I agree with you.
Sure. If there's nothing else for the board, there were a couple things that came up as sort of staff was discussing this earlier that we can
Why
discuss.
don't we
now.
stop for 1 second and just, let's do it sort of statement of, anything more on the statement of basis and purpose before we get into, and then, which could include what you're about to tell us, before we get into any nitty gritty of the rule itself.
I have a comment that may want to be reflected in the statement of purpose, but it's dealing with the rule. So how do you?
No,
want
go
to-
ahead.
Okay. Number, I guess, turning to Exhibit 1, page 6.
And you're still using the December 10 or the?
Yeah, I'm using the December 10th.
Perfect, okay, go ahead.
So I'll skip to H2. So here we talk about, this is the, from a third party, only to cover the percentage of the cost equal to the time spent on the city government business, right? I thought that the AO that references that we relied on had a good explanation of how that's applied. And in the state, I was thinking maybe looking at that AO and incorporating some of that language into the explanation on page 5 of Exhibit 1 of how that's
That's
actually applied.
2016-1,
Yeah,
yeah, I think that's right. I think-
because it talks about, it uses this language about that the primary measurement will be the time devoted to each activity, and then it provides an example. Thinking that might be some helpful language, not to include in the rule per se,
No,
but
but
maybe
as an
in the
illustration.
statement of- as an illustration of the statement of purpose.
It's a good idea.
And just so I'm clear, it's on page 6 of the AO.
Yeah.
Yeah. More on the basis, the statement, and then Chad, and then go back to the, I don't want to overly structure it, it's not like there's a huge amount here, so people just say what they want to say, but maybe it'd be useful to hear from Chad
Well,
first.
that was in the text of the rule, so I can go last.
Okay. Well, why don't you just give us that now and then?
Sure. So it was 2 super minor proposed changes, and then 1 sort of non-substantive but organizational proposal. The first would be at just removing 2 commas on page 7, lines 22 and 23. to strike those two.
I agree with that, makes sense.
The second would be a revision to page 7, line 4,
Right,
such that it would read, "A public servant may use his or her funds and accrued leave for personal travel before or after a trip taken for a city purpose, provided that." And
yeah,
just-
that's good, because otherwise you needed a that after purpose.
That's right.
And that would have been 3 that's in one sentence.
And that's too many that's, that's
Okay.
right. So, and then it'll just read, as I said, and then the third thing, which is organizational but not substantive.
So let's slow down for a second. So I get exactly where you are. So you're in line 4, before or after a city trip taken for a city purpose, is that?
Yeah, accrued leave for personal travel
Right.
before or after a trip taken for a city purpose,
Okay, that-
provided that.
So that gets rid of one that and eliminates the need for another that.
That's right.
Okay, good. And now something more significant.
Well, substantively, it doesn't change the requirements in the rule, but it's organizational. Right now, on page 6, line 12, the approval mechanism for that is described as for a public servant who is not an elected
Right,
official.
right.
And then on page 7, line 8, the rule is silent as to elected officials. But sort of the way this has always been applied has always been that elected officials do not need to seek the approval of other people. This is not an issue for elected officials who head their own agencies, such as the public advocate or the comptroller or the mayor. But city council members also do not need the approval of the speaker to seek approval for travel. So the proposal would be to remove the reference to elected officials at page 6, line 12, and to simply add a new section 7 at the bottom of this, defining agency head approval in a way that's consistent with the board's definition of agency head approval at Board Rules 113E, which says effectively what we envision, which is that elected officials would be able to provide the approval for themselves and for members of their staff. And that would address this, what would otherwise be a question that might come up, which is who is my agency head to approve these things? It would just define it in this way that's similarly defined in other places in the rule.
So you would put in the same section what servants, public servants who are not elected officials do, and
Right,
just
Sorry.
what elected.
Here is the cross-reference to you said 113?
yes.
Yeah, it's not gonna be, because that book is
Oh,
just
we've
a little
already
bit
added
old,
it?
so.
It's been
It'll be
added.
here, so
Okay.
it would start at,
Is this something we've done recently?
yes.
Yes.
So it's not in this book, that's
Right.
right. Okay,
So, E3,
okay,
so the head of the agency served by the public servant or by a deputy mayor if the public servant is an agency head. And then
and then
it
a
just
public servant
defines-
is an elected official,
That's right.
okay, is the agency head, okay.
You've done that.
Yes.
Right, right. I think, doesn't actually say the public servant is an agency head for him or herself. So the real point of this is the council member doesn't have to seek the approval of the speaker,
Yes.
okay.
And to clarify the deputy mayor language for agency heads, which would otherwise be cumbersome to put that into each section of the rule. Here, agency head approval is just, it operates like a defined term at the heel of the rule.
At some point, we might want to come back to this one, because it actually doesn't say that the public servant is his own agency head. In other words, it says the public servant is the agency head for the person working for the public servant. It doesn't actually say that the public servant is his own agency head.
Oh, but a public servant who is an elected official, including a district attorney, may provide the designation pursuant to, its cross-references to things in this rule for him or herself. And the
Okay,
proposed
okay.
language in the travel rule would
Okay.
reflect that, a public
Okay.
servant who is an elected
Okay.
official would be able to provide that for themselves.
Effectively no approval.
They
Effectively no
self-certify.
approval.
They
It's a
self-certify.
form of self-certification, because they have no supervisory official.
Right, right. So essentially, this is about city council members. 'Cause
It-
nobody
it-
else falls to this category. All the other elected officials are executives,
Yeah,
are single-member executive, or in single-member offices.
yeah.
So the only elected officials who are not are council members.
It is, but they are the majority of our.
No, I'm
population.
not minimizing, I'm just clarifying.
No, the public advocate, for example, would.
Right,
be
the
able
public
to
advocate
self-certify.
is clearly,
So,
it
right.
heads his own agency. It's the council members who are the issue, because it's not clear they had their own agency.
And It would be just a version of that language
Okay.
to be incorporated as 7.
We'll have to look at it again,
Right. Yeah.
but it sounds okay to me. More commentary, more questions, suggestions. Okay, well, you got my take, you got my extra that. I was going to go for 3 that's. I'm glad you solved that. And actually, now you're rewriting that Romanette. Is that a Romanette before? Thank you. On line 12, but I actually had a question about the tense.
Yes.
It's written in the present tense. Should it be in the past tense, that the person has already received the approval?
So it would just read, a public servant has received agency head
Yeah, or
approval?
received. But right now it's receives, and that could be after the fact. Receives could be after the trip. And I don't, do we want to, I guess it may turn into a question. Do we want the approval to be beforehand? It does say in advance. Seems to me that, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter, but it seemed to me that the tense ought to be in the past tense, the person received in advance. All right, forget it. Think about it. I put it out there as a thought. I'll leave it to.
That's right, received.
Received. I think
Okay.
since it's it has to be beforehand, it should be past tense relative to the trip. Any further questions, comments, discussions? Okay, then I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendments to Board Rules 101H as the final rule with the modifications, some minor changes to the statement of basis and purpose along the lines of our discussion, references to which exactly advisory opinions we're incorporating, and some more, an illustration drawn from 2016-1 relative to people whose trips have both a city purpose and a political purpose. And subject to also, and with the suggested modification of more cleanly dealing with elected officials separate from non-elected officials with respect to agency head approval.
So just to be clear, you want us to bring this back?
Yes, yes,
Yes, okay. Okay.
Right, but not, well, I guess, so does that mean that I want to have future discussion? I guess I do,
Yes.
okay. So let me pull my motion and revise it, that I call for a motion that the board continue this discussion at a future board meeting in which we will see text that reflects the things that we just discussed. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Any opposed? Okay, then the motion for continuation of the discussion has passed. That's the end of our meeting.